Hi, I'm Meia IISS Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization, and host of the IISS Sound Strategic podcast. In today's episode, I'll be speaking to 4 new colleagues at the IISS Europe office, which has recently opened in Germany. Amid the crisis in Afghanistan and ongoing power shifts in the international order, the IISS has expanded its footprint to Berlin. The IISS Europe office will serve as the central hub for the Institute's engagement with Germany and other European powers, as well as the business and expert community. It'll bring a unique international perspective on questions of geopolitics, geoeconomics, conflict and defense, provided by an international research team, and will bring the very best of strategic thinking to the debate in Berlin. And our experts in today's podcast will showcase some of their innovative research projects, covering topics from European strategic autonomy to addressing the challenges posed by new technologies through arms control, questions about the defense innovation models of European countries and industry, and last but not least, what champagne has to do with statecraft and foreign influence operations. Joining me are Professor Ben Schreer, the Executive Director of the IISS Europe Office, William Alberque, the Director of Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy, Dr. Simona Soare, Research Fellow for Defense and Military Analysis, and Thornike&nbsp, the Senior Fellow for Statecraft and Influence Networks. So Ben, William, Simona, and Thornike, welcome to the show. Ben, let's start with you. What makes the new office in Berlin unique? What will it focus on, and how will it also work with the business community?
We are truly excited to be opening up the new IISS office in the heart of Europe to really focus on some of the hard geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic questions that are of significant relevance for Germany, but also other European powers, because this is the IISS Europe office. And so we will also be looking forward to working with European powers other than Germany. We really bring a truly international perspective on these questions to Berlin. We have already 19 colleagues with 11 different nationalities here in the office. We can also draw, and this is also something which is really unique, on the international expertise of colleagues in our other 4 offices, which are in London, Washington, Bahrain, and Singapore. We also bring the IISS unique convening power and the ability to bring together senior policymakers and other key stakeholders for major events, but also confidential exchange on a whole range of issues of relevance to Berlin. What we also will bring, and that also makes it unique, is that we will really bring a new international facts-based strategic analysis to Berlin and Europe. We will work on a range of hard security issues, such as statecraft and influence networks, the future of alliances, cyber and space capability, military capability analysis, and arms control. But I think this is really important to stress. We are the IISS Europe office, which means we will work on issues of relevance for other European powers. But of course, we will also have a strong focus on issues of relevance, direct relevance for Germany. Last but not least, the IISS brings a long tradition of working with the business sector, including defense companies, and we have been consistently providing facts-based analysis on military capabilities, geopolitical due diligence, and geoeconomic risk assessment. So we're really excited being here, and I think we bring something unique to the Berlin community. We bring something unique to European security and defense. And I think this is precisely the reason why the German government and the German parliament has decided to fund us.
And what are some of the major geopolitical and geostrategic challenges that you just mentioned for the post-Merkel Germany and Europe that the IISS Europe will seek to research on?
There are a whole range of geopolitical and geostrategic challenges of great significance for post-Merkel Germany, because for the first time since 16 years, we have a change of government. And this new German government will find itself in quite a different strategic environment. But also Europe is finding itself in an increasingly challenging strategic environment that simply require new answers and that require fresh thinking. So some of those big challenges and questions include, how will German and European defense policy continue to adapt to the emerging new security order? So, for instance, the reordering happening in Central Asia in the context of the Western withdrawal from Afghanistan, the reordering occurring in the Middle East and the Gulf, in parts of Africa, and also not least in the Indo-Pacific. These are significant trends that are accelerating and that have major implications for the German government, but also for European security and defense. And we'll be looking to providing some fresh thinking in how to understanding those challenges, what they mean, how we might effectively respond to it. Another big question, of course, is the China challenge for Europe, the China challenge for Germany. China is now truly extending its strategic reach, including into European security. This is a trend which will only continue, which will only accelerate, and it requires new answers. It requires also new answers from whoever will govern Germany following the 26th September election. A third major question that we will be looking to addresses the question of the relationship between climate change and armed forces. So, for instance, how can the Bundeswehr, how can other European militaries best adapt to climate change, including through restructuring the way they operate, but also rethinking the way they need to be equipped. That means what kind of technology should they use in 2035? Another big question for German, but also European security regards emerging technologies. And so we will be looking at questions such as, how does the German Bundeswehr deal with the challenge, but also the opportunities potentially provided by hypersonic weapon systems, but also other fully automated systems. And we'll be looking to provide fresh ideas into this, always bringing in perspectives, not just from other European countries, but also from other regions. So from the Indo-Pacific, making use of our office in Singapore, for instance, and the excellent work being done there. A final major strategic questions that we will be looking at will be questions of the weaponization of space, because this is another serious challenge for the international order. It is a serious challenge for Germany, who, for instance, recently stood up a space command. But how do we, for instance, find some ways to controlling the weaponization of space? And if we can't fully control the weaponization of space, how do we make sure that we have some mechanisms to, for instance, avoid unwanted encounters and incidents and accidents in space? So these are just a few of those critical strategic questions for Germany and European powers that we will be dealing with. And in cooperation with our other offices in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, in London, in Washington, we will engage with those questions through a range of activities, providing innovative, data-driven analysis that provide fresh thinking in order to find solutions, as well as working very closely with government and non-government stakeholders, something that the IISS has been doing very successfully since 1958.
Now, William, arms control also has been a heavily debated topic over the last few years in Europe and in Germany. The IISS's Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Program has been moved from our Washington to the Berlin office, and I understand that the focus of the program is shifting somewhat as well. So what is the significance of that move, and what changes are you making, and what do you hope to achieve?
The significance of the move from Washington to Berlin, I think, it's a very important demonstration of how IISS values this topic. In Washington, there are a lot of think tanks who have traditionally dealt with arms control from a US perspective, sometimes bringing in European experts, but really focusing on the traditional US idea of arms control and how that's going to move forward. So moving the arms control function to Berlin is a big deal. This provides IISS, which has all this extraordinary capability in terms of military analysis, in terms of regional expertise and other thematics, to bring together its resources and to talk about this topic through the lens of European voices, European perspectives, with a transatlantic flavor. I mean, obviously, I'm an American. I'm coming out of directing arms control at NATO. But I understand the value of European voices and European perspectives, but also the IISS global reach as well, the other regional offices. This is really going to provide, I think, the Berlin office with a boost. It's going to provide the IISS portfolio with a boost. And I mentioned arms control because I am trying to shift the program from more of the traditional 1990s focus on nuclear non-proliferation or WMD non-proliferation in the context of cooperative security. I think we're looking at right now a world where great power competition is back, where cooperative security solutions seem less and less possible, less and less likely, where even the UN Security Council seems unable to agree upon general principles for how to maintain peace and security. In this realm, we're going to have to look at how international strategy has changed and how great power politics are going to affect Europe, how middle powers in Europe are going to use their alliance relationships to ensure security and peace, and really to work with Germany, with other European voices, to help educate them as well as to hear from them, to have their voices heard, as well as to bring us all up to a common understanding of the threats that we face and how we all in Europe and the transatlantic area and globally can work together to improve peace and security. I think it's a huge win for Germany. I think it's a huge win for IISS, and hopefully it'll be to the benefit of all of Europe as well.
Well, William, let's look at great power competition in a little bit more detail. The US-Russian strategic stability talks seem to be advancing with the possibility of further arms control talks, including strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, advanced missiles, outer space, and cybersecurity. What are the implications for NATO, the EU, and European security of all this?
There's a lot of very important talks that are going on right now between the US and Russia coming out of the summit between Biden and Putin that happened earlier this year. They agreed to strategic stability talks, and now it's a matter for their staffs to set up exactly what the topics will be, the format and the timing. They were under strict instructions to get it done quickly. We'll see how they do. From what we've heard preliminarily, as you pointed out, it sounds like they're going to talk about the next stage in nuclear arms control, which for the United States has to include non-strategic nuclear weapons, weapons that aren't already covered by the New START Treaty, as well as thinking about what's going to follow the New START Treaty, because remember, we only have less than 5 years for that treaty before it goes out of force. But we also have to look at the other things that affect the strategic stability equation, including missiles that can be nuclear or conventional or either. We have to look at peace and stability in outer space. We have to look at cybersecurity. So it's still a little bit up in the air as to what the different subgroups within the strategic stability talks will cover, but we think those are the areas that will be in place. These are all areas of huge concern to European partners, and this is an area where the Europeans can actually contribute as well. We can't think of this just in terms of the US and the Russians are going to go away and solve all these issues. All of these issues have a stake for the allies of the United States, not just in Europe, but also in East Asia as well. So being aware, consulting with the United States is going to be important, but also educating ourselves about what these topics mean and what the impact for security and peace in Europe and in other regions will be. For instance, in outer space, you think, well, maybe my country doesn't have any satellites in space. That's becoming increasingly untrue. More and more countries have the capability now to put assets into space. So what the rules are for those objects in space becomes more and more important. If a country is developing the capability to disable other countries' satellites, you can see how that would be really, really important. And for countries that rely on global positioning, communications, both civil and military in space, an accident or an incident in outer space could be perceived as something leading to war. It could be seen as an escalatory move to try to blind another side's ability to see things, ability to detect missile launches or to conduct military operations, or just knock out civilian communications or internet communications, all these kinds of things. So what the rules will be for outer space are very important. There's a UK initiative in the United Nations. I think more countries need to engage with to try to define what types of behavior are acceptable for space, kind of to develop rules of the road for outer space. This is something where Europeans have a huge interest and a huge voice. So I'll be interested to try to organize workshops, bring together experts here, and try to not only bring everyone together to find out what they feel, but also to get them to feel like they have a voice as well, and to do the research that provides them with answers, with impartial information on what the facts of the ground are and how they can engage. It's the same thing on cybersecurity, cyber warfare. What are the rules for cyber warfare going to be going ahead? You have a huge stake with the European Union and with NATO, and trying to figure out how international law is going to impact cyber operations in the future is a huge area, and an area where any country with a stake in cybersecurity is going to have a say. So again, to provide them with the information that they need and the engagement venues that are helpful. In terms of nuclear weapons, understanding what is verifiable in arms control is going to be really important, because ultimately verification in nuclear disarmament, in nuclear limits, even in nuclear numbers is going to be important in the US-Russia relationship. It's going to be important in the NATO relationship. And, if we ever get China into arms control, understanding how they're going to engage and what it's going to mean. China doesn't have any experience in nuclear arms control, but they are a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have obligations. We've heard more European voices say that China has to engage in arms control in the future. But exactly how should they engage? It's fine to say that they should, but trying to define more of what China's role in future arms control negotiations would be very important. And I'm very excited to hear from Europeans what their opinions on that are, and then how do we engage with China positively to bring them to the table. And not just in nuclear arms control, but in risk reduction, in freedom of navigation, in issues in the South China Sea, and other issues as well. This has huge stakes for Europe because freedom of navigation and transportation and trade are global issues. They're not an issue you can wall off and say, well, that's Asia and this is Europe. We have to bring these audiences together and really have a conversation about the future.
Absolutely. And of course, China is increasingly prominent in the areas of new technology. So, how do you think Europe can help shape the debate regarding the threats posed by emerging and disruptive technologies, including, as you mentioned, outer space, but also bioengineering, hypersonic weapons, AI, and autonomous weapons? How do you see the IISS Europe office injecting fresh ideas into these critical debates specifically?
IISS has some unique capabilities here, again, because we have a big focus on the defense sector and on defense industry. See, for emerging and disruptive technologies, even the title can be a little bit of a misnomer, because some of these technologies are going to be very important for the commercial sector, for legitimate defense purposes, as well as some will just be disruptive. But this is not an area where we can just go in with traditional arms control and bans. I mean, this is an area where we're going to have to think, what are the industry interests? What are the commercial interests? What are the civilian interests? What are the legitimate defense interests? And then what are the military uses that we think should be out of bounds? And so it's not going to look like old school arms control with a treaty that people sign. It's going to look more like the development of common international law, in some cases rules and norms, and in some cases really just understanding what we expect from each other as nations, what we expect non-state actors to do, how we can work together to ensure that the technologies are being used for the betterment of mankind, to increase security in some cases, and in other cases to try to find ways to make sure that certain behavior is not accepted, and that we work together to prevent that kind of behavior from happening. And so again, this is not something for just 2 or 3 countries to talk about. This is the kind of thing that any country with an interest in these technologies, again, for civilian or for defense or for whatever purposes, is going to want to have a voice. And by bringing that sort of impartial analysis and judgment and bring together all the different stakeholders, IISS can do some excellent work and really help the Europeans engage in a consistent and hopefully useful way.
Simona, you look at the analysis of European military capabilities, and in the context of new emerging technologies, you see that this will be a core part of what the IISS Europe will focus on. So, can you talk a bit about what you see as some of the major challenges for German, NATO, and EU strategy in this area, and how the office will contribute to addressing some of those?
What we're trying to do in the IISS Europe office is have an applied conversation about the uses of a wide variety of emerging and disruptive technologies in defense. And with respect to that, we're looking both at the way that member states in NATO and the European Union are seeking to integrate artificial intelligence, are seeking to invest in research of quantum, sensor technologies, space technologies, and others. We're also looking to understand the added value that institutions like NATO and the EU can bring to the defense innovation conversation, and the added value of projects that NATO and the EU can support with respect to the integration and adoption of emerging and disruptive technologies that complement each other, complement what individual nations are doing, and also ensure an optimal level of interoperability between our forces, which is really the core of what has sustained both these institutions so far and has ensured solidarity among the allies and the members. In terms of specific challenges that we're seeing with emerging and disruptive technologies, I'd point out 3 or 4 of them. The first ones would definitely be the technical ones, whether that has to do with maturing certain types of technologies. For instance, we're looking at European allies that have had a level of vulnerability with respect and dependency with respect to digital technologies more broadly. So looking forward, artificial intelligence is definitely one of the areas that they need to mature. We're looking at acceleration of adoption of other types of technologies that perhaps are already strong or are benefiting from significant investment over the past 4 or 5 years. I'm talking here obviously about big data analytics, cloud and edge computing, all of these and sensor technologies we've seen bring in a lot of investment and interest over the past years. Finally, I think that there's also an issue to consider here with respect to perhaps giving a little bit more thought, especially on the European side, of the application in defense of certain technologies like biotechnologies, where Europe has a real strength in the civilian sector, but perhaps less so in the defense one. And then finally, there's an issue of considering investment in technologies that Europe does not have, such as hypersonics, and that are really at the core of international competition right now. So this is a class of technologies that Europe does not currently possess. These are all key questions for European security moving forward. Another aspect that we're trying to do is, obviously, funding challenges are there. This is nothing new in the European security debate, but we're trying to move the conversation on emerging and disruptive technologies and defense from the investment gap towards what areas we should actually jointly focus our investment so that we get the most added value and we are able to integrate these capabilities rapidly into our military capabilities. Finally, and I think that William referenced this earlier, there are challenges, significant ones, I would say, with ensuring proper governance for these technologies, as in when they are integrated into our military capabilities. And this has to do with decision making. And I think that moving forward, a lot of questions will revolve around what are the specific requirements that these new technologies bring to the decision making process. What are some of the new aspects we need to consider in terms of getting ahead of the conversation and not letting ourselves be trapped by speed requirements or volume of information that comes our way from the use of artificial intelligence and autonomy.
Now, as Ben Schreer, the executive director of the IISS Europe office, mentioned, the IISS Europe office will also work closely with industry in Germany and Europe. And the analysis of military capabilities, and especially the ones that are on the frontier of development, as you just mentioned, requires perhaps a closer examination of the role of defense industry, an examination of the defense industry in and of itself. So, what opportunities do you see for your work at the office to closely work with German and European industry partners moving forward?
I think that industry is a natural partner for us, not just because of the enduring legacy that IISS has working with industry, but also because in this overall challenge related to emerging and disruptive technologies, I think that defense industry and tech industry more broadly are definitely interested to take part in the conversation and shape it as well. What I see in relation to European defense industry is certainly a different position that we've seen with, for instance, our allies across the Atlantic, where there's a really strong impetus to work in different ways, in more agile ways, if you want, with governments in terms of the adoption of particularly digital technologies and software-based capabilities. In Europe, I think that the reflection is innovation itself is not an issue, but rather access to critical materials, to raw materials, has been one of the obstacles that we are seeing. So the input from industry has been very strong on this side, pushing governments to definitely help in that. The other aspect that has been consistently underlined by industry has been the predictability and sustainability of budgets, particularly on the research, development, and innovation side. And I think that we're seeing already an improvement in the situation through NATO developing dedicated structure, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, that is backed by a venture capital fund that will support innovation by engaging directly with startups. I think that is certainly one key aspect of the conversation that needs to be developed. I think the European Union is following in those footsteps with the Commission, having launched over the past 2 years at least 6 such venture capital funds that invest in different types of emerging and disruptive technologies on the market, and are trying to attract far more funding from the capital markets to help them back up startups that are very promising in this sense. So I think that industry is already trying to be part of the conversation and move the conversation towards a different way of working with governments. In terms of what the IISS Europe office can offer, I think where we're trying to contribute to the conversation is to help understand what different countries' needs are in relation to industry. I think that it's not a blanket approach. Not every government engages with industry the same way. And I think that both at the national level, but also through NATO and the EU, these needs need to be better understood so that instruments such as the ones I mentioned from NATO and the EU are better tailored to address these needs.
Now, Thornike, William already mentioned that we're in a era of great power competition. And it is, of course, in this new era of strategic competition between free liberal democracies and authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states like Russia and China and others that we see the application of traditional and non-traditional means of influence and control to undermine Western liberal democracies' ways of life. So what do you see as the key challenges in this space for Germany and Europe, and how can the IISS Europe office help understand these challenges?
Yes, there are many challenges, and IISS is not only interested in hard security, as my colleagues just mentioned, but also in soft security and in all these attempts from the revisionist countries and states to influence Europe. What's happened chronologically is that after a decade of unilateral domination of the West and the ideas such as the end of history and the victory in the Cold War, these revisionist states emerged and their practices have developed. And at the beginning, at the first stage, these countries were trying to protect their own zones of influence, geographical zones, and talking about cultural relativism and saying that democracy and liberalism is just limited to the cultural realm of Europe and Northern America. But since, let's say, a decade or so, these revisionist states moved to another level of challenge, and now the battlefield is coming to Europe and to the West in general, and in Europe in particular. That's why IISS's European office is interested in studying these challenges and trying to identify the vectors these revisionist, authoritarian, semi-authoritarian states are using, try to understand also their efficiency, because now we have already sufficient time to observe what among these tools or vectors were efficient and those who were not efficient. The tools and vectors that fall under simple tactics and those who were more directed against and have serious implications in terms of fighting against our models, etc., etc. Another challenge is to understand the methodology, because the methodology is quite different from the period of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the revisionist camp, let's say it was mainly the Soviet Union and then the communist camp, tried to seduce the West with the lack of information and with the control of the information. Now the lack of information and control of information is impossible. So the methodology is to overwhelm with the information and to provide as much information as possible. And sometimes, and very often, by the way, this information is contradictory. How, for example, these revisionist states are on one side supporting the political parties in the West that are against immigration. At the same time, they're also pushing and using immigration as a tool in order to weaken our democracy. So the methodology has changed with the use of new technologies, and it's completely different situation as compared to the period of the Cold War. So this is also one of the challenges. The IISS will try to analyze the differences between the providers or different state actors who try to impose their views and to influence our democracies. There are significant differences between, let's say, Russia on one side, China, and to use more semi-authoritarian states like Turkey. We have different approaches they have of economy, of investments, of corruption, etc. So this is also among our goals to see what are the differences and how to identify and how to increase our resistance and resilience towards these practices.
Absolutely. And as you said, rightly so, when it comes to the challenges posed by countries like China, these are often multidimensional and various in nature. So to what extent do you see new synergies between the private sector, governments, and think tanks like the IISS in contributing to solutions for these challenges?
So the governments, the private sector, and the think tanks can only complement each other and help each other in first understanding the situation, and then also to set up the different ways to resist the current challenges. Governments have another temporality. They are influenced by the electoral cycles, and the business is motivated by development and profit. So the advantage, let's say, in quotes of the think tanks, is to have time for reflection, to identify the problems and to study them in depth. When it comes to the business, especially, and to private sector, here in Europe and particularly in Germany, there is this strong liberal idea of using economy or trade to attract, to develop relations, and then to engage the countries in order to diminish the conflict. And this is a very old liberal myth that comes from the 18th century and Montesquieu's sweet commerce, and that the commerce and trade has this characteristic of softening conflicts. But so far, what we see here now, since a decade or two, is that these practices did not really work, and these practices resulted in more influence of revisionist states and authoritarian states on our in our part of the world, accepting their terms of or their rules. Just one example that recently occurred: Russia decided to apply the term of champagne only to the sparkling wines produced in Russia, and the French company, the biggest company exporting champagne to Russia, accepted the rules that the Russians were proposing. So this is something that we should see very carefully and try to help the private sector to avoid this kind of vulnerabilities. On the other side, this kind of relations also exported corruption to our countries, and quite often, instead of softening political or geopolitical relations with these countries, we see now very strong networks of clientele or developing in our countries in their support. And when our private companies are involved in this kind of relations and are involved in corruption, this makes them more vulnerable, and the risk is growing. Many of them maybe have difficulties to understand how strongly authoritarian states intervene in private sector, and what is the level of the crackdown these countries are having on the private sector in their own countries. So this the private sector should be also interested in our work and consider the analysis that we are proposing and the solutions as something important to decrease the risks and the vulnerabilities, especially even more for mid-size or small enterprises that are maybe even more vulnerable in engaging investments or trade with this type of states.
Well, Thornike, it's never a bad day when you end a podcast speaking about champagne. I'm going to thank you, Ben, William, Simona, and Thornike, for coming on the show and talking a little bit about your areas of expertise, and we look forward to following your research. We have a rich lineup of research topics that we'll be following in the months to come. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. And for more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you and see you next time.